All right, let's go. Number 10, the footprints that broke the Ice Age barrier. For years, David Bustos, the resource program manager at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, watched a strange pattern surface on the gypsum flats of an ancient dry lake bed. After a rare desert rain, faint human-shaped depressions would rise out of the mud, visible for a day or two, before the wind erased them again. Locals called them ghost tracks. In 2016, Bustos brought the problem to Matthew Bennett, a professor of environmental and geographic sciences at Bournemouth University in England, who had spent his career reading footprints as forensic evidence. Bennett's team, working with U.S. Geological Survey researchers Kathleen Springer and Jeffrey Pagati, spent years excavating trenches through the footprint horizons, hunting for one specific thing: layers of ditchgrass seed, Rupia serosa, sandwiched directly above and below the tracks, precise enough to radiocarbon date. When they finally found a sequence with dozens of footprints bracketed by datable seed layers, the results, published in the journal Science in September 2021, were almost impossible to accept at face value. The footprints were between 23000 and 21000 years old, laid down not after the Ice Age, but in the deep middle of it during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets a mile thick buried most of Canada. This predates the Clovis culture, once considered without serious challenge the founding population of the Western Hemisphere by roughly 10,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Giza by close to 18,000 years. It predates the invention of pottery anywhere in the Americas. It predates agriculture itself, on any continent, by thousands of years. Elsewhere along the same fossil surface, the footprints turn predatory. A ring of overlapping adult tracks tightens around the deep, rounded prints of a giant ground sloth, an animal that could weigh well over a ton, and the sloth's own tracks show it rearing back defensive before the trail breaks off. In a separate study of the site, Bennett and his colleagues concluded the pattern was consistent with a coordinated hunt, several people working together to corner and exhaust an animal capable of killing any one of them alone. Mammoth tracks cross the same horizon alongside the prints of dire wolves and American lions, all part of a Pleistocene landscape in which humans were already unmistakably apex predators. But here's where the standard explanation faced its hardest test. Critics pointed out that Rupia seeds can absorb old carbon dissolved in ancient water, throwing radiocarbon results off by thousands of years, a legitimate concern and one the team spent 2 more years answering. One prominent skeptic, the archaeologist C. Vance Haynes, proposed a more specific alternative in 2022, that the seeds themselves were ancient but had been washed out of older sediment and redeposited on ground, actually walked by ordinary Clovis-era people only 13,000 years ago. Bennett's team pointed out the fatal flaw in that scenario directly in print. Ice Age megafauna tracks are interleaved with the human footprints at the same horizons and mammoths, and giant sloths were long extinct by the time any Clovis person could have left a footprint there. In 2023, Pagati and Springer returned with a second entirely independent method, besides dating quartz grains from the same layers using optically stimulated luminescence, a technique with nothing to do with carbon at all. It confirmed the same window. A third line of evidence, 26 additional radiocarbon dates pulled from a nearby Paleo Lake sequence, closed the loop by 2025. 3 independent methods, 3 separate teams, 1 answer. What makes this particularly unsettling is what it implies everywhere else. If people were walking across New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they did not simply appear there. They had already crossed Beringia, already found a way past or around walls of ice 2 miles high, already raised children who grew up doing ordinary things. A young woman, or perhaps an adolescent girl, crosses a muddy lakeshore carrying a toddler on her hip. She sets the child down to rest her arms, then picks up her pace again. Dire wolf tracks and the prints of a mammoth cross her path minutes later or years later. The mud keeps no calendar. We do not know her name, her language, or a single word she ever spoke. We know only that she was in a hurry, that she was carrying someone smaller than herself across a dangerous plain during the coldest stretch of the entire Ice Age, and that every academic model of when humans reached this continent had to be quietly rewritten to make room for her footprints. Number 9. The cut marks that predate an entire continent's official history. Between 1977 and 1987, Canadian archaeologist Jacques Cinq-Mars excavated 3 small limestone caves above the Bluefish River in Yukon territory and came away convinced people had used them as much as 25000 years ago. Almost no one believed him. The claim contradicted everything the field accepted about when humans reached North America, and without a second site to back it up. Bluefish Caves was quietly set aside for 3 decades, the bones boxed, the excavator's reputation absorbing the cost of an idea the discipline wasn't ready for. In 2011, Lauriane Bourgeon, then a doctoral candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the Université de Montréal, reopened the boxes. Working under her advisor, Professor Ariane Burke, she spent 2 years examining 36000 individual bone fragments, under magnification, sorting through a chaotic assemblage in which carnivore tooth marks alone accounted for damage on well over a third of the material. Searching underneath all of that noise for the specific signature of stone tool butchery straight V-shaped grooves, with fine internal striations cut at angles no rockfall or scavenger could easily produce. She identified 15 bones that met the standard without real ambiguity and sent samples to Thomas Hyam at the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit. The oldest, a horse mandible with cut marks, left by a tool used to strip the tongue from the jaw, came back at 19650 radiocarbon years, calibrated close to 240000 years before present. That is 10,000 years older than the Clovis first migration date that governed the field for most of the 20th century. It makes Bluefish Caves, once dismissed as an embarrassment, the oldest confirmed archaeological site in North America by a margin of nearly 10 full millennia. But here's where conventional archaeology hasn't been able to fully close the case. A cut mark on a 24,000-year-old bone can look under magnification disturbingly similar to marks made by other forces. Entirely a falling rock, a carnivore's tooth dragged across bone at the right angle, an animal trampling a carcass into soft mud. Later, experimental studies replicated some of these natural processes and found they could, under specific conditions, mimic the striations Bourgeon had catalogued. It's a fair caution, and the original team has never waved it away. What it hasn't done is explain 15 separate bones from 2 separate caves, clustered at the specific anatomical points associated with butchery, spread across a coherent 12,000-year stratigraphic sequence. The deeper implication reaches into the genetics of everyone descended from the Americas' first peoples. Geneticists had already proposed something called the Beringian standstill hypothesis, the idea that the ancestral population, which would eventually fill 2 continents, spent thousands of years marooned in Beringia, neither in Asia nor the Americas waiting out the ice. Bluefish Caves is the first physical radiocarbon-dated site to sit inside that waiting period. For 3 decades, an archaeologist's evidence sat in storage while his colleagues decided his find couldn't be real. He did not live to see it vindicated. Somewhere in a cave above a frozen Yukon river, people butchered a horse and left the marks of their labor in its jaw, 24,000 years before anyone in power was ready to believe them. Number 8. What 14,000 years of human waste revealed. In the summer of 2002, Dennis Jenkins, a senior archaeologist with the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, walked into a string of shallow, wave-cut alcoves above the dry bed of Lake Chihuahuan in Oregon's Lake County. For roughly 85 years, homesteaders, pot hunters, and university field schools had picked through the Paisley Caves without finding anything the field considered conclusive. Jenkins suspected the deeper, undisturbed sediment still held something worth the trouble. Over 3 field seasons, his crew recovered more than 700 coprolites, desiccated feces, human and animal preserved for millennia in the cave's bone-dry air. A team led by geneticist M. Thomas P. Gilbert, working with Jenkins and an international group of collaborators, extracted mitochondrial DNA from a handful of the coprolites and matched it to haplogroups found today in Siberia and the Americas. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest samples at roughly 14300 years old. Because obsidian tools cannot be radiocarbon dated directly, a separate consultant, Tom Origer, spent a year tracking the underground temperature of the cave to calibrate a technique called obsidian hydration dating, measuring how much moisture had penetrated a flake stone tool, since it was made an independent clock running on the physics rather than chemistry that landed on the same broad era. Published in Science in April 2008, the number mattered enormously: unambiguous human waste, and therefore unambiguous human presence, in the Pacific Northwest, a full 1,000 years before the earliest confirmed Clovis sites. 700 samples, 1 cave system, 14,000 years of intermittent continuous use. But here's where the standard explanation ran into real trouble for a while. Skeptics raised an uncomfortable possibility. Water percolating through porous cave sediment for 14 millennia could carry DNA downward from younger deposits, contaminating older layers with genetic material that had no business being there. It wasn't an unreasonable objection. Unlike a stone tool, a coprolite's DNA is mobile in a way that flint never is. Jenkins spent the better part of a decade answering it, returning to Paisley for additional seasons, and eventually bringing in Lisa Marie Shalito of Newcastle University, whose team applied lipid biomarker analysis tracking the chemical residue of digestion through the cave sediment, independent of DNA entirely, to test whether the deposits had genuinely moved. The stratigraphy held, the dates held. What makes Paisley particularly unsettling isn't only its age. It's what sat beside the coprolites. In 2012, Jenkins's team recovered western-stemmed projectile points from the same strata dated to roughly 13200 years old. A full tool-making tradition, distinct in form from the fluted Clovis point existing at the same time as Clovis itself. For decades, Western stem technology was assumed to be a descendant of Clovis, evolving after it. The Paisley dates suggested something else, two technological lineages running in parallel, possibly representing two founding populations that arrived by different routes and never fully merged into one tool-making culture at all. We know these people only through what their bodies discarded, the last thing they ate filtered through them left behind in the dark. 14,000 years later, it was still enough to prove they got there first, and that they may not have been alone in getting there. Number 7, the village at the bottom of two continents, and the argument that still isn't over. In 1975, a veterinary student walking the banks of a creek in southern Chile, where illegal logging had torn open the earth, noticed a strange bone eroding out of the mud. It looked at first like the remains of a cow. It was part of a mastodon. The find led geologist Mario Pino and a young archaeologist named Tom Dillahay, then teaching at the Southern University of Chile, to a waterlogged peat bog on Chinchihuapi Creek, 36 miles from the Pacific coast, that would occupy Dillahay for the rest of his career. What the peat had preserved was extraordinary wooden hut foundations pegged into the earth, chewed pieces of medicinal seaweed carried in from the coast, hide cordage, a wooden mortar all sealed under bog that had denied oxygen and therefore decay to organic material for more than 14,000 years. Dillahay's radiocarbon work, refined over decades, settled on an occupation age of approximately 14500 years for the main settlement layer, Monte Verde II. In 1997, a delegation of skeptical archaeologists, invited specifically to try to break the claim, toured the site in person, and left convinced. Their conclusions, published in Science, are widely credited with ending the 50-year dominance of the Clovis first model, because a village in southern Chile, 1,400 miles south of the equator, was now older than the earliest Clovis sites in North America by more than 1,000 years. If Clovis people were first, they would have had to cross the Bering Land Bridge, travel the length of two continents, and build a permanent settlement in Chile before their own culture had technically begun. The chronology doesn't survive contact with the evidence, and Monte Verde II was never the deepest layer at the site. Beneath it, Dillahay identified a second, far more fragmentary horizon, scattered charcoal, a handful of possible stone artifacts, nothing as rich or as undeniable as the settlement above it that he has argued may date to 18,000 years or more. Mainstream archaeology has never accepted this lower layer, known as Monte Verde, with anything close to the confidence granted to the layer above it. It sits in the literature as an open question nobody has been able to close in either direction, a whisper of something older still underneath a site that was already on its own radical enough. But here is where remarkably the standard explanation is, under direct assault again right now, not from skeptics of pre-Clovis archaeology in general, but from a team attacking Monte Verde specifically. In 2026, University of Wyoming archaeologist Todd Suravel, working with Chilean geologist Claudio Latour and colleagues, published the first fully independent reinvestigation of the site in nearly 50 years. Their argument? The ancient wood Dillahay dated had eroded out of far older upstream deposits and been redeposited by the creek into much younger sediment, meaning the true occupation layer could be as recent as 4,000 to 8,000 years old, arriving thousands of years after Clovis, not before it. Dillahay's response was immediate, accusing the new team of shaping their data selectively around a conclusion they had already settled on before the fieldwork began. Ben Potter, An archaeologist with no stake in either paper called the new sedimentary analysis convincing on its own terms. As of this recording, the dispute remains completely unresolved. What should unsettle you here isn't simply that Monteverde might be wrong. It's that the site widely credited with rewriting the peopling of two continents treated as settled fact in textbooks for almost 30 years is only now receiving its first truly independent scrutiny, and that even so, geneticists like Jennifer Raff at the University of Kansas point out that the DNA evidence for a pre-Clovis peopling of the Americas doesn't actually depend on this one site holding up. The paradigm may well survive. This particular pillar of it might not. A wooden hut frame sunk in a Chilean peat bog for what may be 14,000 years, or maybe closer to 6. Somewhere inside that gap of 8,000 years sits the answer to who really arrived first. And for now, the people who've spent their careers on this question can't agree on how to find it. Number 6. The mastodon bones that are 100,000 years too old to exist. In 1992, road crews widening California State Route 54 outside San Diego uncovered a jumble of fossilized bone. Richard Cerruti, a site monitor stationed there specifically to watch for finds, during construction, recognized what the machinery had exposed: the partial skeleton of a mastodon, its bones strangely fractured, lying beside a scatter of large, rounded cobblestones that had no obvious business in that sediment. Cerruti flagged the site. The museum recovered the remains before construction resumed, and the bones sat largely unstudied for over 15 years. In 2008, Stephen Holen, an archaeologist with the Center for American Paleolithic Research, examined the specimens and by his own account doubted what he was looking at before he believed it. Working with Thomas Desmarais, curator of paleontology at the San Diego Natural History Museum, Holen spent nearly a decade building a case. Their team dated the bone using uranium series analysis, a radiometric method suited to material far too old for radiocarbon, and arrived at a figure of approximately 1,300,000 years. They documented spiral fracture patterns consistent with fresh bone broken while still green, not fossilized, two femur heads positioned face to face, a tusk standing vertically in the sediment, and 5 cobblestones bearing impact marks they argued were consistent with hammerstones and anvils used to break the bone for marrow. Published in Nature in April 2017, the implication was staggering. Hominins of some kind were processing mastodon carcasses in North America, more than 100,000 years before modern humans are known to have left Africa in any lasting numbers, let alone crossed into the Americas. That is not 10,000 years earlier than the standard timeline. It is roughly 6 times further back than even the White Sands footprints, and 10 times further back than the Clovis first model that dominated the field for most of the last century. But here's where mainstream science has pushed back hard and has largely not been persuaded. A formal rebuttal from a coalition of prominent archaeologists, including Tom Dillahay of Monteverde, argued the Cerruti team's own methodology couldn't rule out far more mundane explanations: heavy construction equipment operating directly above the deposit in 1992, ordinary geological trampling, or natural post-burial fracturing that produces spiral breaks with no hominin involvement at all. A separate 2018 study compared the Cerruti assemblage to other mastodon sites with no suspected human activity and found the damage patterns weren't meaningfully different. Critics also point out that accepting the claim means inventing an entire undiscovered hominin population in the Americas, roughly 1,150,000 years before the next oldest confirmed evidence of any human presence on the continent, a species with no bones, no other tools, no other trace, anywhere on the landmass. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and cobblestones beside broken bone, however, suggestive may not clear that bar. Holen and Desmarais have never withdrawn the claim. When one group of critics proposed that the cobblestones had actually washed in from a since-vanished alluvial fan and simply landed by chance beside the bones, Holen and Desmarais replied that no sedimentological or geological evidence for any such fan exists anywhere in the surrounding formation, and that the counter-hypothesis still can't explain why the stones and bones consistently cluster in 2 distinct concentrations, why the femur heads sit face-to-face, or why the tusk stands on end. Unlike most disputes in this field, this one shows no sign of narrowing toward consensus in either direction. Somewhere, In that unresolved space between a construction site and a peer-reviewed journal sits a possibility most of the field has chosen not to seriously entertain that. Something walked, this continent split open a mastodon's bones for the marrow inside, and left no other trace of itself, in any form for the next 115,000 years. Number 5, the Clovis boy who fathered a hemisphere. In 1968, construction workers grading a stretch of private ranch land near Wilsall, Montana, broke into a collapsed rock shelter and found something they had no framework for dozens of stone and antler tools dusted in red ochre, arranged around the remains of a small child. Archaeologists identified the tools as Clovis technology and the burial as the only human remains ever found in direct association with the Clovis culture, anywhere in North America, the sole individual out of a tool-making tradition that stretched across an entire continent whose actual body had been recovered. If the machinery grading that field had passed 3 feet further east, the only body ever connected to that culture would still be sitting unmarked and unknown under a Montana pasture. The child designated Anzac, one waited more than 4 decades for genetic science to catch up to him. In 2014, a team led by Morten Rasmussen and Eske Willerslev, both then at the University of Copenhagen's Center for Geogenetics, extracted and sequenced his complete genome, the first full genome ever recovered from a Pleistocene-age individual anywhere in the Americas. Radiocarbon dating fixed his age at approximately 12600 years old. He had died as an infant, 1 to 2 years old, and had been buried with more than 115 tools. A scale of offering that alone marks the burial as extraordinary for the period. What the genome revealed reached far past one Montana hillside. Anzac, one proved more closely related to living indigenous populations across North, Central, and South America than to any other people on Earth, more closely related, in fact, to populations in Central and South America than to some indigenous groups in far northern Canada. Researchers estimate a substantial share of all Native Americans alive today across 2 continents carry direct genetic descent from the population this child belonged to. The same finding quietly dismantled a competing theory that had circulated for years, the so-called Solutrean hypothesis, which proposed Clovis technology had crossed the North Atlantic with Ice Age Europeans. Anzac, one carried no European ancestry at all. His lineage traced cleanly to Siberia and East Asia, and nowhere else. But here's where the discovery turns from triumphant to something closer to unsettling. Buried inside the same genome was evidence of a split, a divergence between northern and southern Native American population branches that had already occurred before this child was born, meaning the population that produced him had already been fragmenting, spreading, specializing for an unknown span of time before 12600 years ago. Anzac, 1 is not the beginning of the story. He is a single, extraordinarily lucky data point recovered by chance from construction equipment on a Montana ranch, caught in the middle of a demographic expansion that had already been underway for millennia, whose true point of origin still cannot be pinned to a specific place or year. In June 2014, after consultation required under Montana law, the Anzac child was reburied in the Shields River Valley, not far from where he was found in an intertribal ceremony led by representatives of the Crow tribe. A child no older than 2 dusted in red ochre, and surrounded by more than 100 tools by people who loved him enough to spend that wealth on his burial, carries inside his DNA the genetic root of tens of millions of living descendants across 2 continents, and still cannot tell us where his own people came from or how long they had already been walking before they laid him down. Number 4. The girl in the black hole who broke a 2-population theory in half. In 2007, a team of cave divers led by Alberto Navablanc of the Proyecto de Espeleología de Tulum was mapping a flooded chamber deep in the Sac-Acton cave system on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula when their light swept across the floor of a pit roughly 150 feet down. They named the chamber Hoyo Negro Black Hole for the absolute darkness beyond their beams. Scattered across the floor were the remains of at least 26 Ice Age animals, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and extinct elephant relative called a gomphothère, all of which appear to have wandered into the dry cave, searching for water sometime during the last ice age before the floor gave way beneath them. Among the bones lay an almost completely intact human skeleton, a teenage girl, 15 or 16 years old, whom the team named Naya. Hoyo Negro remains a Pleistocene time capsule to this day, and a fragile one. After unauthorized divers entered the chamber and were photographed disturbing the site, Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History concluded that leaving Naya's remains in place exactly where she fell was too great a risk, and portions of her skeleton were carefully removed. For safekeeping, a rare intervention for a site otherwise left exactly as the Ice Age had arranged it. Dating her required two independent methods. Yamane Asmaram and Victor Polyak at the University of New Mexico used uranium-thorium dating on calcite deposits that had grown directly onto her bones after death, establishing a minimum age near 1,200,000 years. Radiocarbon dating of her tooth enamel run separately produced a maximum age near 1,300,000 years. The window narrowed to somewhere between 12 and 13,000 years, making Naya one of the oldest and by far the most complete human skeletons ever recovered in the Western Hemisphere. The findings led by archaeologist James Chatters were published in Science in May 2014. What made Naya consequential wasn't only her age, it was her face. Chatters described her skull as narrow with a low prominent forehead, a flat nose, and outward projecting teeth, a shape starkly different from that of modern Native Americans, and one shared by a small handful of other early American skeletons scattered across two continents. For years, that gap in morphology fed real scientific speculation that the earliest Americans might represent an entirely separate migration, a different founding population from the one that gave rise to today's Native American peoples. But here's where the standard fear, more than the standard explanation, fell apart. When researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA from Naya's teeth, it matched a haplogroup tracing directly back to Beringia, common among indigenous peoples of the Americas today. Her skull looked like it belonged to a different population. Her DNA said otherwise without ambiguity. The resolution wasn't a second migration. It was evolution acting on a single founding population in real time, facial structure, shifting across a few thousand years of Ice Age adaptation and post-glacial, settling into less mobile lifeways, while the genetic thread underneath never broke. There's a smaller, stranger footnote buried in this discovery. James Chatters, the archaeologist who identified Naya's skull as anatomically distinct, was the same forensic scientist who 18 years earlier had been the first person called to examine a different set of ancient remains, pulled from a riverbank in Washington state, remains that would ignite the most bitter legal battle in the history of American archaeology, over a skull that looked to him like it didn't belong either. A teenager fell into the dark, reaching for water in a cave that had not yet flooded, and drowned in a hole with no bottom she could find. 12,000 years later, her face told scientists one story about who she was, and her DNA told them another, and only one of those stories turned out to be true. Number 3. The ghost population buried in two infant graves. Since 2006, Ben Potter, an archaeologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had directed excavations at a site called Upward Sun River on a bluff above the Tanana River, roughly 50 miles south of Fairbanks. In the summer of 2010, his team found the partially cremated remains of a 3-year-old buried beneath a residential hearth, significant enough on its own. It was what they found 3 years later, digging 15 inches deeper, beneath that same hearth, that changed the trajectory of an entire field. In a separate pit lay two more infants, one who had died within weeks of birth, and one who appeared to have been stillborn, a late-term fetus never delivered into the world at all. They had been buried together, wrapped with ochre-stained hunting darts and antler foreshafts, sometime during a single devastating summer roughly 1,150 years ago. Salmon bones scattered through the surrounding hearth deposits show the camp's residents were already exploiting seasonal fish runs alongside big game evidence of a subsistence strategy more sophisticated than the mobile, mammoth-chasing image often attached to Ice Age Americans. Local indigenous communities gave the two infants names Zak Itianen Tidi Guy, Sunrise Girl Child, and Yokanen Tidi Guy, Dawn Twilight Girl Child. Genetic analysis of the older infant, led by J. Victor, Moreno Mayar, and Eski Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen with Potter, was published in Nature in January 2018. Researchers expected her DNA to confirm what demographic models already assumed, that she descended from the same founding population as every other Native American north and south. Instead, her genome placed her on a branch that split from all other Native American ancestry somewhere between roughly 22,000 and 18,000 years ago, a lineage so distinct and so undocumented that researchers had to name an entirely new population to describe it. They called them the ancient Beringians. If that hearth had eroded 3 feet further into the riverbank, if the crew had closed the excavation one season earlier, an entire branch of the human family, a population that existed, diverged, and nearly vanished without a single prior, good trace in the archaeological record would have stayed exact that, nothing. Erased not by conquest or catastrophe, but by simply never being found. But here's where it turns genuinely disturbing rather than simply surprising. Demographic modeling built from her genome suggests the ancestors of every Native American alive today, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, first split from East Asian populations around 35000 years ago, then spent thousands of years isolated likely in Beringia itself before splitting again, one branch becoming the ancient Beringians who stayed largely in place, the other becoming the ancestors of every other indigenous nation across 2 continents. The ancient Beringians appear to have persisted in the Alaskan interior for millennia after that split, practicing the same toolmaking traditions as their southern cousins, before disappearing from the genetic record entirely by around 6,000 years ago. Absorbed, replaced, or simply died out. No one can currently say which. Her people are gone. Not conquered in any recorded sense, not documented in any oral history, that has reached us simply absent from the genetic record after a certain point, as though a branch of the family tree had been pruned and the wound healed over. So, completely, that no one downstream ever knew it had been. There. She and the infant beside her, buried in the same pit during the same terrible summer, are among the only reasons we know her entire population existed at all. Number 2. The skeleton the United States government fought over for 20 years. On the 28th of July 1996, 2 college students wading through shallow water along the Columbia River on their way to watch hydroplane races near Kennewick, Washington, stepped on something solid and looked down to find a human skull, staring back up at them. Police called in James Chatters, a local forensic archaeologist, to recover what turned out to be a nearly complete skeleton. Chatters' initial reading of the skull's shape led him to describe the remains in early reports in terms typically applied to European or Polynesian populations rather than Native Americans, an assessment that would detonate into one of the longest legal disputes in the history of American science. Then, a stone projectile point embedded in the man's hip bone and partially healed over forced a second look. Radiocarbon dating placed him at somewhere between roughly 8340 and 9200 years old. A coalition of 5 Columbia Basin tribes, including the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla and the Yakama Nation, sought custody of the remains under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, recognizing the skeleton as an ancestor and demanding his prompt, respectful reburial. 8 scientists filed suit to block them in a case that would become known as Bonnickson versus United States, arguing the cranial evidence left his Native American affiliation unproven. In 2004, a federal court agreed, granting researchers continued access instead of returning the remains. Chatters himself would later write an entire book about the discovery and the fight that followed it, evidence of just how deeply the case had lodged itself in the field. For the next decade, the man, the tribes called the Ancient One, sat in the collections of Seattle's Burke Museum, physically present and legally unclaimed, a 9,000-year-old human being at the center of a dispute neither side could resolve through argument alone. Not resolved by better arguments. Resolved by a technology that hadn't existed when the argument began. But here's where the field's founding assumption completely collapsed. In 2015, Morten Rasmussen and Eski Willerslev's team at the University of Copenhagen extracted and sequenced Kennewick Man's genome and ran the comparison. The original cranial studies never could not shape against shape, but DNA against the genetic diversity of living human populations worldwide. The result was unambiguous. Kennewick Man was more closely related to modern Native Americans and specifically to the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, who had pressed one of the original claims, than to any other population on the planet. The skull's shape, it turned out, had never been reliable evidence of ancestry at all, a fact the same research team demonstrated directly by reanalyzing the original craniometric data and showing it couldn't on its own reliably distinguish Kennewick Man from other Native American individuals in the comparison set. A separate laboratory at the University of Chicago independently confirmed the finding the following year, closing off any remaining scientific objection. In December 2016, Congress intervened, directly ordering the Army Corps of Engineers to complete repatriation within 90 days. On the 17th of February, 2017, at the Burke Museum, the remains were formally handed to representatives of the 5 claimant tribes. The following day, more than 200 tribal members gathered along the Columbia Plateau to bury him, according to their own traditions. Nearly 21 years after 2 students on their way to a boat race had found his skull looking back up at them from the shallows. What should sit with you longest isn't the 20-year delay. It's what caused it, an entire body of scientific and legal argument built on the shape of a skull, a method with roots stretching back to the racial typologies of 19th century anthropology, deployed with total institutional confidence for 2 decades against the plain word of the plain. People who had never stopped calling him their ancestor. It took a molecule, not a measurement, to finally listen to them. Number 1. The mummy that waited 76 years to go home. In August 1940, Sidney and Georgia Wheeler, a husband and wife team working for the Nevada State Parks Commission, were surveying dry caves east of Fallon, Nevada, trying to document archaeological sites before guano miners could strip them bare. Inside a small rock shelter near Grimes Point, they found 2 burials wrapped in woven tulle matting. One, laid deeper than the other, had been naturally preserved by the cave's bone-dry air. A man roughly 5'2", somewhere in his 40s, wrapped in a rabbit-skin blanket and wearing moccasins, his body carrying a partially healed skull fracture and severe dental abscesses that may well have contributed to his death. Alongside the burials lay 67 artifacts, baskets, tools, worked bone, a finely woven tulle mat. The Wheelers estimated the man's age at 1,500 to 2,000 years. They photographed him, sealed him in a box, and shipped him to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. Both Wheelers died without ever learning who or how old he actually was. He sat in that box for over 50 years, until museum anthropologist Amy Danzy and curator Don Tuohy decided the collection deserved a second look. In 1994, they sent samples of his hair bone and wrappings to Irv Taylor, a radiocarbon specialist at the University of California, Riverside, hoping new dating techniques could finally settle his age. Taylor tested 17 separate samples. When the results came back, the museum's own team assumed something had gone wrong with the method. Taylor tested again. The number held 9,415 radiocarbon years plus or minus 25, a calibrated age of approximately 10600 calendar years. Not 1,500, 10,600. That makes the Spirit Caveman the oldest naturally mummified human being ever found in North America, and one of the oldest anywhere on Earth, older than the first mummified pharaohs of Egypt by roughly 6,000 years. He was mummified by accident in the same arid air. Egyptians later learned to engineer on purpose 60 centuries before their first deliberate mummification. The announcement made at a news conference in April 1996 triggered a legal and cultural collision that would run for 2 full decades. The Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, whose ancestral homeland includes Spirit Cave, requested the man's return under federal repatriation law almost immediately. The Bureau of Land Management, which held jurisdiction over the site, resisted for years, citing the same skeletal morphology dispute that had entangled Kennewick Man 300 miles to the north. The tribe, initially wary of allowing further study of a man they already considered family, eventually agreed to genetic testing, understanding it might be the only path left toward bringing him home. But here's where the explanation built entirely on skull shape, the one used for 20 years to keep a man out of the ground, finally and completely fell apart. Researchers led by J. Victor Moreno-Mayer and Eska Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen sequenced his genome as part of a broader study spanning 15 ancient individuals from Alaska to Patagonia, published in Science in November 2018. The Spirit Caveman's DNA showed direct genetic continuity with the modern indigenous peoples of the Great Basin, with the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, specifically the people who had called him family from the beginning and never needed a laboratory to tell them what they already knew. Buried in the same dataset was something almost impossible to hold in your head all at once. His genome sat remarkably close to that of a contemporary individual buried thousands of miles south at Lagoa Santa in Brazil, implying the population both men descended from had crossed the entire length of 2 continents coast to coast, tip to tip. In a span of time, one of the study's co-authors, David Meltzer of Southern Methodist University, described as startlingly fast for foot travel on that scale. By the time the formal genetic confirmation reached print, the tribe had already brought him home. Control of the remains was returned to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe in November 2016, and he was quietly reburied, Not in a museum drawer, not in a peer-reviewed supplement, but in the ground his people had never stopped calling his. Consider what that means all the way down. A man who lived and hunted and broke his skull and endured by the evidence in his own bones. Real and lasting physical pain was laid to rest by people who loved him enough to wrap him in rabbit fur and moccasins. For a journey they believed was over. He waited in a sealed box for 56 years while the science that could finally read his story caught up to him. He waited another 20 while institutions argued over whether the people who had never stopped claiming him were allowed to have him back. Every founding population counted across this entire hour, funnels down to this one man. The footprint makers at White Sands, the butchers at Bluefish Caves, the infant girl at Upward Sun River, and the ghost population she alone proved existed. The Clovis child in Montana, the girl in the black hole, the man pulled from a Columbia River sandbar 300 miles north. Every one of them connects thread by thread to an unbroken line of descent, running from a mummified man in a Nevada cave to the living, breathing members of a tribe who buried him twice 10,600 years apart. You exist, whoever you are, wherever your own ancestors walked from, because some version of that thread never broke. His very nearly did. It took 10 millennia and one laboratory to finally let him rest. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.